Hi there. Good to see you. I'm very sorry for the very slight delay there. I had pressed the wrong button somewhere. I was being somewhat challenged by technology, but thanks again to John, one of our wonderful technical people. He told me what to press. So thank you, John, if you're watching. And to those of you who have just joined us, welcome. It's been really good to be with you again over the last week, and we've enjoyed reading your comments and reflecting and thinking on some of the answers and comments that you made to the questions that we had set. It's been really good to have you with us. This week, of course, we were thinking about barriers. Last week, we looked at international legislation, and we thought about who was marginalised, which particular groups of learners. And this week we were thinking about why some of these learners were marginalised. And we were thinking about barriers that we feel are just barriers, whether you're sitting with us here in Scotland or whether you are in some other part of the world. That was Kasia just popping in to say hello there. And Badria is here with us this week as well, so it's good to have them here beside me. So thank you to those of you who posted some questions for us. They made us think, and they're challenging questions. As I was saying yesterday, I beg your pardon, last week, often you end up having more questions once you do something like this. And while we're not claiming to have all the answers, we are delighted to talk about and to discuss some of the issues that you're raising. I know some of you are watching this after the live event, and it's very good to have you watching. And if you can hear my phone ringing in the background, and Kasia's just going to check who that is. We're going to look at the questions that were posed on our Save the Date page, but we would also be really happy to have questions from those of you who are watching live. And I can see already in our questions section at the side here, there's some questions coming in, and Kasia and Badria will feed those into the discussion. So let's get started. One of the questions that was asked was about this idea of health and well-being. Is this denied if there's no access to quality education? I think one of the things that struck me about the Millennium Development Goals, clearly I was very interested in number 2, that was all about universal primary education. But it did always strike me, if we also didn't think about the other goals, then just having one goal that met was never going to be enough, and we have to think, I think, about everything in the round. And I think this idea of health and well-being, that certainly in Scotland here, we've really picked up on health and well-being. This notion of every teacher being responsible for health and well-being of young people. And health is not just I guess confined to the medical idea of health and to people who work in medical circles, but I guess it's about your whole being, your whole person, that kind of holistic view of an individual. And I think for me, health and well-being, education has very much got a part to play. And I think as human beings, we like to be active, we like to be involved often, we like to be with people. And these things I think are very important to us and help to contribute to our health and well-being. Just last week, in fact, last weekend in the UK here, there was a report released about young people's mental health and the difficulties and the stresses that young people felt under. Some of that was linked to education. Some I heard on the radio the other day, some young people talking about the pressure they felt under to perform or to get good exam results and to behave in certain ways. And I think I think we need to think about all of these things when we're considering inclusive education. So the question says, is health and well-being denied if there's no access to quality education? And so I guess I'm kind of saying, yes, I think health and well-being will maybe not be denied, but it may well be affected if we don't engage our minds as human beings. And this, I think, is not just for young people. And I think the kind of learning and the engagement of those minds may not happen only in a school context. I think it can happen in many places other than just school. And so health and well-being, very important. It's very important for countries that their population is healthy and has a degree of well-being about themselves. And I think that extends also to your understanding about yourself, about relationships with other people. So it's an important part, I think, of thinking about inclusive education and quality education. So that was one question. Another question centred around the issue of homework. The person who asked this question was asking about what we thought were the benefits of homework, and particularly maybe at an early age. And homework, certainly in the context that I have worked in a lot in Scotland, is often quite controversial. And I suppose, actually, I was once in a primary school in Scotland. I'd been invited by the parents to go along to speak to a group of parents, and teachers were there too, but the parents had invited me, and the parents had asked me to come and talk with them about learning and teaching and all sorts of things to do with children and young people and learning. And kind of almost as a slight throwaway comment during my talk, I said, I started to talk about homework, and I don't really know why. I hadn't planned to, but I ended up talking about homework. And I had made the comment that I think that homework gives rise to a lot of stress in families sometimes. Parents trying to get on to getting on to children to do their homework, to complete their homework, to do it neatly, to do it on time, etc., etc. And I said, I just think it causes a lot of tension. I know that sometimes the children end up in tears, sometimes the parents end up in tears, and really I just don't think this is a terribly helpful or fruitful thing to happen. And then I said, actually, if I was your head teacher, I may just completely abandon homework. And there was a kind of sharp intake of breath, kind of from parents and from teachers. And I kind of thought, oh, I've obviously said something a little bit controversial here. So I moved on, went on to talk what I was there to talk about. And at the end, it was really, really interesting, because a conversation started between the teachers and the parents. And the parents were all saying, but we thought you gave homework because, so the teachers were saying, we gave homework because we thought the parents wanted it. And the parents were saying, but the parents, we thought you gave homework because you wanted it. And there was this complete mismatch of expectations. And the teachers were saying, well, when you send it, or when the child brings it back, we've got to mark it. So it's extra work for us during the day, because if we send it home and it doesn't have a tick or some comment on it, parents think we haven't looked at it. And parents are saying, well, it just causes us so much stress and we end up fighting. And so what actually came out of that was the school and the parents, the teachers and parents together with the children, discussing a homework policy. What would a homework policy look like? And I actually sometimes wonder if a good piece of homework might be something like, come back tomorrow and tell me 3 things you learned today. Or tell me 3 things you learned about such and such that we were talking today. And come back with good questions about what you've learned, because to ask a good question, you have to have understood what you were learning in the first place. And I think homework has a place. It shouldn't, I don't think, always be about reinforcing what you've learned in school. I think it should be perhaps occasionally something perhaps new that you have to go and find out. I think offering a range of possible things children can do as homework over perhaps a piece of time, rather than I give you this on Monday morning and you do it on Monday night, might be useful. But I think teachers have to think very carefully about why they're giving homework, and what is the purpose behind the homework. And I certainly think where it causes great tension in the household, that possibly isn't a terribly good thing to do. I think parents spending time with their children, talking to them, listening to them, reading with them, asking questions, maybe those are good things for parents and children or carers to be engaging with young people at home, not always doing some kind of big set piece of homework, so many sums or sentences or whatever. Certainly homework also offers an opportunity to practice, and it is also to try and help young people to realise that learning doesn't just happen between whenever school starts in Scotland, that would be 9 o'clock, and when it finishes at 3:30, but sometimes you also need to do additional reading, thinking, learning at another time in the day. But again, I think that's a very valid use for homework, but I do think we need to think carefully of what activity is that we ask children to do as part of their homework. If we're saying that learning, if we're trying to motivate them and keep them engaged in learning, then we need to make sure that the homework that we're offering and suggesting that they do keeps them motivated and interested in the topic and in the subject. There's a big survey in Scotland are very concerned that people are happy to say, oh, I'm not good at mathematics. And there's a big survey asking adults and young people about, when do you use maths? How much do you use maths? Would you like to get better at using maths? And I think if our homework is simply reinforcing that, maths is just sitting upset about it and there's a lot of tension around it, well, that's maybe not going to do much for increasing the love of mathematics, which can be a hugely engaging subject, a very creative subject. So I think we need to think carefully. Homework has a place when it's thought through and thought about carefully.
So education or health and well-being.
So following on from that first question related to health and well-being, what comes first? Education or health and well-being? Well, maybe it's not about coming first. Maybe that's a little bit like that notion of which comes first, the chicken or the egg, and maybe the two things have to come together. I wonder actually if that in some ways links to, there was a question that came in about curriculum and assessment, and if I can maybe link my answer to that additional question about which comes first, health and well-being, to my answer around the notion of curriculum and assessment. When I was thinking about curriculum and assessment, I found myself starting to think about what becomes the focus of assessment. And I think where our focus becomes very outcome driven, then that's got the potential to narrow curriculum and we start getting teachers teaching to the test. And so I think if we think of education in that very outcome driven way, and that we're trying to kind of standardise children, we're trying to get standardised test scores, we're trying to do standardised things with children, then I think if that's the focus of our education, then that's not going to help necessarily the health and well-being of our young people. So I think we need to think actually about health and well-being and education in tandem with each other. And I guess in developing countries, for example, although not only in developing countries, and I'll give you an example of why I'm saying not only developing countries, but I suppose I'm thinking here of children who arrive in school having not eaten. And that physical, I think the person mentions also Maslow's triangle of need, or not higher pyramid, sorry, not triangle, of need. And, when you're hungry, that very much affects how you're going to learn, how you feel. Emotions, all of these things affect learning. So I think we have to think about them in tandem. And perhaps we need to think about the role of education in also some of these basic needs. I guess some of the examples that Maggie gave in the little the write-up that Maggie had done about the work that she was doing in Kenya, you know, for me, some of that was where education and health and well-being were coming together, where they were addressing the physical needs of some of those children alongside the educational needs and through the space, if you like, of school. I say that the idea of coming to school hungry, I started talking about Kenya because I was thinking about Maggie. A long time ago, I worked as a teacher who supported children who had extreme social, emotional, behavioural difficulties. And in actual fact, one of the things I did with some of those young people that I helped and supported, one of the first things we did in school in the morning was we came together and we made slices of toast. We got bread and butter and jam and peanut butter and all kinds of toppings. And we spent the first half hour of the day learning to make toast. In some instances, the children were learning to spread butter on the toast with a knife because they didn't actually know how to do that. And we sat and we ate together. And for many of these children, that was breakfast. They had arrived at school with having not eaten since the night before. And some work was also done with parents around helping them to know how to cook. And how to cook in a nutritious meals. So I think for me, education and health and well-being have to come together. If education simply becomes about test scores and passing exams, then I think as a society, whichever society we're part of, we may well have some issues there. Have we got any other comments coming in here, Kasia?
Yes.
Yes.
It's more a comment, education should be a self-discovery. But we have a question as well. What is the step to take in order to involve government, societies and schools, I guess, to work together to support infrastructure?
Oh, right. Okay, so one on education, a comment, I think, as you say, education should be self-discovery. That's difficult for a teacher because it's about letting the student learn. Is that right? It needs to be to let the student learn rather than teaching. Yeah, I guess that question is perhaps relating to the idea of the role of the teacher. Is the teacher there as a kind of co-investigator with the young person, or is the teacher there to impart knowledge? And I guess it's those two different kind of approaches to education that perhaps that person is getting is kind of getting at there. And I certainly think that when we learn together, when the teacher learns alongside, but teachers also work together. We do have a curriculum to teach and we do have certain things, so it's about getting a balance, I guess, between that as well. Okay, I think I'm going to come back to the questions that were posted on the Save the Date page. So if I just check my paper here, we did the health and wellbeing, we've talked a little bit about that, we've looked at the homework one, I've touched on the curriculum and assessment one, and to come back to that curriculum and assessment one too, I think where assessment is used to plan and develop appropriate learning experiences, then I think assessment has the power to include rather than exclude. I guess it's that idea of we measure what we value rather than valuing what we measure. And so for me, assessment is a hugely important part. I think as an educator, we're kind of always assessing. Sometimes it's in a formal way, but other times it's in an informal way. We're kind of watching the young people, and it doesn't actually matter what age the learner is. I was with some adult learners yesterday, and there was one of them that I just felt didn't look terribly well. So you're kind of always looking and assessing and reading your audience. Have I talked too long? Are they fed up? Are they jiggling about? Or so I think assessment is a crucial part of learning. And I think the question was asking about the power of assessment to exclude and marginalise. And yes, I think it can. I think it can marginalise you because of how we undertake it, because of what we value. And of course, if you've been marginalised, you're then further marginalised, because if you haven't passed the assessment, it stops you also getting kind of future opportunities. And as I say, I think it was Mel Ainskow, a writer here in the UK, on the notion of inclusion, that talks about measuring what we value rather than valuing what we measure. So that, just to come back to that question there. I'm going to leave one of the questions that I had to really think hard about. I'm going to leave it till the end because it was an interesting one, and I'm going to kind of leave it with you for you to ponder as well. Another question was around wealth, and whether wealth was the kind of biggest influence over exclusion rather, and marginalisation. And I guess wealth's a relative thing, depending on where you are and who you're beside and who you compare yourself to. How wealthy are you? Throwing money certainly doesn't always fix something. They were talking, I think, if I remember, there was comments about a wealthy person can pay for their child and young person to get into particular schools, for example. Now, that's absolutely right, it can. But I think we need to be careful that we don't then assume that because you've paid to get education and paid to get into a particular school, that necessarily follows that there will be quality. I've spoken to parents who have done just that, and who are still saying, my young people are struggling. My daughter, my son is still struggling. So I think we must be careful not to make assumptions. I think certainly, undoubtedly, wealth buys you opportunities, or can buy you opportunities, or at least allows access, I should say, maybe not buys, but allows access to opportunities. Opportunities within school, but also perhaps opportunities out of school. Opportunities relating to the world of work, opportunities relating to meeting influential people who can help you, people who can help you to get a job, people who know somebody who knows somebody. So I think wealth and affluence is undoubtedly linked to this, because I think also linked to all of this is the concept of poverty. And clearly, if you're living in poverty, your wealth is therefore limited. I think the question also asked about what can we do to overcome the rich-poor divide when it comes to education. I think for me, we need to think very carefully about the role of private providers, perhaps. I think competition and league tables, where we set up schools to say one is better than another, based sometimes on kind of quite crude or arbitrary measurements, is not going to be terribly helpful either. There is a divide between rich and poor, and I do think sometimes in certain parts of the world, perhaps due to austerity measures, that gap is widening. And I think there is great concern. I have great concern around that. And that perhaps links quite well to that next question about the 1-2, about how can government, societies and schools come together to support this. And I think there is, that it is going to require that. The question then becomes, of course, I've just suggested that perhaps allowing a kind of a raft of private providers may, while on the one hand allow children to access education, we're back asking about the quality perhaps of that education, and who accesses it when and how. So I think there are some big issues related around wealth, poverty, and how we try to bridge that gap. And certainly my own government here in Scotland, the Scottish Government, are very, very concerned about how we can bridge that gap. And we're looking very seriously at how we can try to raise attainment for all, not the idea that we raise the attainment of the bottom, if you like, those who are not achieving, not only them, but it's about raising attainment for everybody, and not just those who may be deemed to be, if you like, not unsuccessful in their education. Somebody's asking if we are thinking of education as a product or a commodity, if we've kind of strayed far off from the true meaning of education, so that we're thinking of it as a product or a commodity. Sorry, let me read the question properly. And also a comment about this kind of one size fits all, no customization. And I certainly think that it kind of always interests me that we've learned so much about learning in the last, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, and partly through how much more we know now through medicine. We have an MRI scanner here in our university connected to the School of Psychology, and I had the privilege one morning of watching an experiment that was taking place, and the person was lying in the scanner and they were all wired up, and I was watching different bits of their brain all light up as certain things were happening. And I mean, I was absolutely transfixed. I didn't understand the science of it, but it was quite incredible to watch and to talk with the people who do understand the science behind it. And it does strike me that the more we've learned about our brain and learning and how we learn, and realised how individual in many ways we all are, at the same time we seem to have around the world tried to standardise education and learning, and those two things really just kind of don't, for me, quite gel together. And I think it brings us back to that whole idea of maybe what we will come on to talk about next week in our course here, this idea as well of difference. And that we are all different. Now, there are lots of similarities that we have about us too, but I do think that yes, we probably have started to think of education as a product, and perhaps some of the kind of the political ideologies that have been driving many governments in the world has not perhaps helped us to think of education as something different, and the kind of liberating thing that education can perhaps be. What have we got here? Okay, another question that's come in, and thank you very much for those of you who are posting questions or just popping in to say hello as well. It's really good to see you, and I see somebody says thank you for an answer. That makes really good sense, and that's good to know. One of the nervous things about doing a Google Hangout is that I have some notes here that I've written for myself, but also I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head, and that's always nerve-wracking and can sometimes be dangerous too. So thank you very much for saying that. I appreciate that. So somebody's just asked us, I think one of the main mistakes related to education is that we only take the knowledge as education, missing other two important parts, skills and attitudes. And actually I think suggesting too that maybe those are two are kind of most important. And I think you're right, and I think education has often been thought of as this kind of knowledge bit, and I guess sometimes our assessment systems, we end up testing that knowledge and asking you to tell us back what you've told us, which isn't always necessarily what we've then been doing. When I think of that in relation to our own system here in Scotland, certainly up until now, we have been very much focusing on skills and attributes, and we've had a broad general education for our young people from the age of 5 when they start formal schooling here through to about second year, which would make them about 14. And then they start to select subjects, and they are preparing then to sit our national exams. And I think our curriculum at the start was very bold. Our Curriculum for Excellence was quite bold in suggesting that it is about the development of skills and abilities. We need to help young people. The whole idea of what are the skills and abilities that we need for the 21st century. That idea that's often said that we're actually educating young people now for jobs that we don't even know what those jobs will be. We're no longer in an industrial period where you're churning children out to work in a factory and so on. And certainly in our context here in the UK. And so I think skills and attributes, working together as part of a team, learning how to share, all of those kind of things are skills that we can start, very early on. I was talking in class yesterday with a group of teachers about that idea of the skills that we're trying to develop and starting these skills very early on. So the idea of turn taking, of sharing, starting, in preschool, and building on those. So I think those are actually really important. I think that's an important question to ask. I think we do have to watch, though, that we don't go to the other extreme and say that it's only about skills and attributes and attitudes. I agree, I think they are very, very important, but knowledge has a place too. And in order to be a critical thinker, for example, well, you need to have something with which to critically think. And I guess it's about how you bring all of that together. But I think I would tend to agree with that comment that we have sometimes kind of place knowledge above other things, whereas perhaps we need to be thinking more kind of horizontally about these things, or bringing them together at any rate, so that one maybe doesn't kind of trump the other, if you like. I'm loving that the issue of contacts and not what you know, but who you know is being recognised as an issue and factor which can hold some learners back. How many potential Nobel Prize winners are slipping through our fingers? Well, there's an imponderable question. I wonder if perhaps it might be a lot, I don't know. But I certainly think there can be so many barriers, I think. And there was also a question, I think I'm right in saying, yes, there was a question about our barriers context specific. And I think context can be specific. But I think the barriers that we've been talking about this week, and indeed today as well, for me, these barriers exist in all the contexts. Poverty, we're suggesting on our course, is a barrier. Now, it might look different, and some of the poverty, for example, that I've seen in Tanzania looks different from the poverty that I've seen here in Scotland. But the outcomes of living in poverty, whether it was in Scotland or Tanzania, are the same. These children were marginalised from education, they were excluded from opportunities, they were hungry, so I'm not sure that the barriers are context specific, but I think the contexts are certainly specific. And I think for me, one of the exciting things about this course is seeing so many of us from so many different contexts discussing these barriers and then trying to decide how do we overcome those barriers in our own context. Interestingly, yesterday with these teachers that I was working with, I'm always hugely energised after a day of working with teachers. And both Kasia and myself actually were working in different groups looking at different things, and equally great to work with. But one of the teachers on my course, somebody called Leslie, said, we were talking about barriers to learning actually, and she said, you know something, I prefer to think of hurdles, not barriers, but hurdles. She said, because you can jump over a hurdle. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, I really think I quite like that. Not only can you jump over it, but you can crawl under it, and you can go round it as well. Now, I suppose you can do that with barriers too, but we also started to talk in class about the Olympic Games, and actually, I'm not, I have to confess, not a huge fan of watching athletics, but actually I do really enjoy watching the hurdles unless they fall, in which case that just brings back bad memories of a little girl falling and really badly scraping in my knee when all the dirt goes in it and you've got to get it picked out and it's terribly sore. My heart goes out to these hurdlers who fall. But as long as they don't fall, I think it's a great race to watch as they get into that stride and jump. And I really like that analogy, and I said to Leslie, I'm going to use that tomorrow, I think, in the Google Hangout. I'm going to share that with teachers and educators and parents and all the people that are involved in our course all around the world. So maybe we start to think about hurdles that we can go over, under, or around.
As a positive attitude.
And, pardon?
As a positive attitude.
As a positive attitude, Badria, indeed, yes. And because, woof, I hit the barrier. It's kind of brick wall. It's kind of, whereas hurdles are perhaps they're not so solid. You can see under them, around them. So yeah, thanks, Leslie. I like that idea. So I just thought I'd share that with you, and hopefully you like it too. Oh, a tricky question. So I'm not convinced I'll be able to answer this, but let's have a go. Can the various school accreditation bodies, I'm not sure where this person comes from, but certainly in the UK we have a number of accreditation bodies here. Can they be a barrier to innovative and creative education delivery models? Many times their basic functioning framework begins with education having to be delivered in the brick and mortar. I think, if I'm understanding that question correctly, you're suggesting it's about perhaps it's this notion of being outcome kind of driven again. If you're still online, if you want to clarify if that is what you're thinking about. But I think often education bodies are regulatory bodies. They're making sure that exam scripts are marked or exams are set in a good way, and with some kind of parity across markers and all those kind of very functional aspects. I guess it would be one thing that these kind of bodies would do. Is it the body's fault, as it were, or is it our system that's demanding these kind of standardized outcomes at the end that then means a body is set up to regulate those? Are we back to a kind of chicken and egg question, perhaps? The minute you put a test, I guess, into learning, you do in some ways, or the danger can become that we decide there's only one way to do the teaching and learning to get us to that outcome. And I certainly think in terms of creative learning, you do need perhaps space to be able to do that. I was a perfect answer for this either, but somebody said, well, is it okay to be creative when you also are coming, for example, from a wealthy background and you're going to be able to access all these opportunities anyway? If you don't have that privilege, if you like, should you then just go for the kind of, bread and butter stuff in order to try and get that opportunity that others have? The only thing I would say, I suppose, is that creative way, they actually will, it's not, what am I trying to say? This is one of the issues with online live things. You've got to think on your feet. I suppose what I'm thinking is that that you can actually perhaps pass exams equally well by engaging in creative learning as learning chunks of knowledge to regurgitate for an exam. And one of the other things is that I think somebody asked, or I saw a comment on one of the bits during the week, that what did I see? Hang on a minute. I've just read a question and now I've got that thought in my head. Somebody's let me come back to this and I'll see if I can remember what my thought was. Somebody's just said, I'm from the UN. It's connected to the tricky question about accreditation bodies. So I'm not sure what time it is where you are in the US, but I suspect it might be morning, so good morning. With our accreditation bodies, it is expected that all education is done in the traditional classroom. Oh, it's connected. It's the same person that asked the tricky question. Hi, Gary, sorry. Yeah. And I'm not sure that's necessarily going to get you the results you want. I actually was with somebody from the US this week. They came to see myself and a colleague, and we were talking about that very issue, about, I think they were monitored 3 times a week by different people who came in to watch what they were doing, and they very much felt straitjacketed, if you like, into teaching in a certain way. And I do think that is problematic. I think if we take away that creativity, not only for young people, but that creativity for teachers, then yeah, I think it's maybe a little wonder that we have some of the issues that we have in our classrooms. I suspect there's a correlation there between those things. It is that notion that there is only one way to get to an, and I don't think learning and learners fit nicely in a kind of this is how you do it way. And that's in some ways why it's quite difficult for us to, when you're doing something, a kind of a course like this, that we were very aware as we were writing it and talking about it and setting it up, that we weren't going to provide, that we were going to have lots of ideas and people needed to take them and make them work in their context. I'm not sure if that's helping, Gary, or not, or if you feel that is answering your question, but it's a good question, and yes, it is a little bit tricky as well. I think, do we have any more questions coming in, or will we jump to our yep, are we ready to jump to our last question? The last question, Rachel, I find it, yeah. The last question has really made us think. And again, I'm not sure there's one answer to it. So thank you for posing this question. And let's, those of you who are watching this after the live broadcast of this, if you're watching at the weekend, just have this mulling over in your head. Those of you who are watching and with us, spend the weekend, if it's weekend for you, thinking about this. And bring these thoughts to week 3, because in week 3, we're going to talk about what we do in classrooms. Now, we're very much thinking on classrooms in a very generic kind of way. We were very conscious that as we all each speak about classroom, we have a picture in our head of what a classroom looks like. And that's why it's been very helpful as we've been putting this course together to work with Badria, who's thinking it in the context in Saudi Arabia when she thinks of a classroom, and Kasia is thinking about Poland. I'm thinking about Scotland, and as I've also had the privilege of being in other countries and continents, and classrooms look different. Young people have never looked different, but the classrooms look different. So the question is, what is the biggest barrier to inclusive education? Well, I don't know. I think there are a number of barriers. As to which is the biggest, I wondered eventually, having thought about lots of barriers around resources and money and opportunity and all these kind of things, I wondered if actually it might be the concept of normality. This notion of being normal. Because it strikes me that one of the big issues in all of this is that when we talk about groups of learners that are marginalised and excluded, whether that be for disability or you belong to a particular group, for example, the Roma, one of the most marginalised groups and excluded groups in Europe, or, well, pick a reason, any reason. It's this notion that they're different from everybody else, and the rest of us are kind of normal. And I often wonder exactly what normal is. And I wonder if our lived experiences challenge us to perhaps expand our sense of normal and challenge us to actually think about our shared humanity. Because I think if we focus always on the difference, then that's always what we see. Is what is different about these learners, what's different about these people, these others that are not like us. However, I think if we focus on what we have in common, then we start to get to that idea of shared humanity. And I think when we start to think about our shared humanity, it encourages us to think of ways of including and going over those hurdles or under those hurdles or around those hurdles or barriers, whichever word we're going to use. But it takes us to a point where we're starting to actively think about including and not excluding. And perhaps just to kind of finish our Google Hangout today, I'm going to leave you with the words of Gandhi. At least I think it was Gandhi who said this, that our ability to reach unity in diversity will be the beauty and taste of our civilization. So there's a thought for you as we leave week 2, where we've been thinking about barriers, and we move towards week 3, where we're going to think about what we can actively do to include those who are marginalised and excluded. Thank you very much for joining us again this week. Thank you to those of you who are listening in later, and we're really looking forward to seeing you again in week 3. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.